Hi everyone, my name is Teresa Shin, and my presentation tonight is based on the article Family Immigration Histories and the Construction of Identity by Naomi Norke from York University. This article is based on 20 interviews conducted with first-year teacher candidates in York University's Faculty of Education about their family immigration histories. The students' stories about immigration most often fit government's officially sanctioned versions, and the stories also often challenged the officially sanctioned versions. I'll elaborate on these sanctioned versions later in the presentation. Although it was not included as part of the interview question, name change stories were shared by 7 students, and the author chose 4 of these stories for this article, for which a qualitative approach was used by interviewing each student for 1 hour. From the analysis of these stories, the author found that complex and contradictory relationship exists between immigrant experience and Canadian identity, which will be explored in this presentation. So the question is, where are you from? The students were invited to share their family stories of immigration. This request was based on the fact that everyone, with the exception of Aboriginals, is from somewhere else, and that all Canadians have other origins, and identity is somehow fashioned through our connections to our origins. Through the process of self-interrogation, the students were looking at their immigrant identities. The 4 examples of the name change stories were categorized into 2 areas: names changed by government or employment officials, and names changed by the immigrants themselves. The first story is an example of Teresa's story. The name change was made by an employment official for the purpose of assimilating non-Anglo immigrants with an anglicized name. So for Teresa, this resulted in denial of the original identity by others. She felt that her great-grandfather, his contribution to nation building with Canadian Railway, needs to be recognized as part of her Italian heritage. And in Donna's story, it's the name of her great-grandparents were changed by the government officials. And she felt that it's also an indication of that lost name signified lost language and culture, and the identity bestowed upon a person, although there's no connection there. For Donna, whose families have immigrated several times, first from Portugal to Guyana, a Commonwealth nation, and then to Canada across several generations, question is, does her identity originate in the country or the region of origin? And also, these name change stories are stories of loss, of erasure, and they illustrate the way in which immigrant experience can be a dual process of undoing and changing or becoming at the same time. For Philip, his stories of his grandparents who chose a neutral name, a name that they felt was reasonable for political reasons at the time, that there would be less hassle. And during World War II, having a German-sounding name may have had other consequences. In Stephen's story, the name changed, but the name was changed by his grandparents, but it wasn't anglicized. Again, it was a neutral name, and the grandparents were Polish Jews, and he didn't know the history, and he wasn't curious to know about the history, his history, and what does this mean when people simply do not know their family history? How does it affect the individuals? And is not knowing simply part of the story? What part does it play in identity construction? So these, all of these participants identify themselves as Canadians. So what does being Canadian mean to them? Who counts as Canadians? And some of their responses indicated that the length of time that their families had been in Canada in terms of both years and generation did not make them feel any more or any less Canadian, and that being Canadian was something conferred through birth or through acquiring Canadian citizenship and carrying a Canadian passport. And the immigration histories reflected the immigration policies of the era when the families immigrated and their experience of hardships that resulted from unfairness or mistreatment and ethnocentrism, racism, and classism were some of the examples given in the article. The officially sanctioned definition of Canada regarding Canadian identity states that the story of development of this country is a story of immigration, that to be a Canadian is to be an immigrant. So there seems to be a large gap between the detailed stories of immigration and what constituted Canadian identity. For the 20 participants, being Canadian neither included immigrant experience nor immigrant status, which changes the officially sanctioned definitions of Canada and Canadian identity. Instead, the students spoke about the Canadian identity in relation to Canada's social safety net, not being Canadian, the geography and landscape and the climate, and that it did not include their statements did not include the traditional signifiers of culture such as religion, foods, festival, or clothing. The name change stories remind us of the fragile relationship between identity and identification, between who we think we are and who others think we are, and between the possibilities and limitations, our own desires, and the judgments of others. Identity and identification are not fixed. They are fluid and are shaped and changeable depending on our current contexts and desires. The contemporary developments in identity and identification started taking off in the early 1980s. In 1970s, this framework was first developed by Henry Tajfel with social identity theory, which addresses a list of phenomena such as prejudice, discrimination, ethnocentrism, stereotyping, intergroup conflict, conformity, normative behavior, group polarization, crowd behavior, organizational behavior, leadership, deviance, and group cohesiveness. Quite a list there. this article actually has helped me to look into my own experience of name change. When I first arrived in Canada in 1975, I found that I didn't like the anglicized pronunciation of my Korean name. And the other factor was that most people had problem remembering my name. So I found it much more easily communicable when I used a name that the people were familiar with. The use of my baptismal name as part of my first name helped with these issues. However, I found that my last name easily identified me as a person of Asian origin, and all that this may mean to an individual with whatever their previous experiences with other person of Asian heritage may mean to them. I often wonder when I submit resumes and cover letters how the name may represent me. How does my identification relate to the others' experiences of a person with similar last name? And if experiences are used as a way of accumulating constructive knowledge, how does an individual disseminate the uniqueness of each individual in this process? Other factors to consider include absence of student teachers with Aboriginal heritage. What does this factor indicate about the discourse within post-secondary education? And the presence of an Afro-Canadian descendant of the United Empire Loyalists also challenges traditional assumptions that white people were the first to immigrate to Canada. The third point is tendency to tell the stories mostly of male relatives. What role does gender play in immigration and in the rendering of that experience? So the silence of the female relatives. And lastly, what are some of the assumptions or connections between immigration history and entitlement and privilege? Are there any? So the following is an interview that Alan Gregg from TVO had with Adrian Clarkson on immigrants to Canada last year. I believe the first 4 minutes would be relevant to the issues discussed in this article. The questions for discussion that'll be posted on Blackboard are 3 questions, and the first one is: by sharing their histories, students learn much about the historical and social context of both immigration and identity construction. Do you feel that this type of constructive activity would help to establish multicultural and anti-racist approaches to teaching and learning? Why or why not? Do you have a family history of name change that you wish to share, the reasons for the name change and how it affected your construction of immigrant identity or identification? Do you feel that a person's name is telling about who the person is and where they are from? How does it affect identification of a person? And some references. And thank you for watching.